Hi, welcome to the last bonus lesson. Today we will refer to the concepts we learned in the training and build on them, adding a little more context. And this lesson will generally be a little bit for the more advanced. So if you are looking for some nuance here, maybe a little bit of that different perspective on your profession, you've come to the right place. So let's not drag it and we'll jump straight into examples. Let's start with a compositional analysis and maybe approach it a little bit differently than in the previous bonus lessons. We're not going to talk about the forms, lines, depth, and geometric contrasts here. We will now turn our attention to something else, very distinctive. So let's get at it. The first thing that we can notice is that the camera is quite low above the water. This water line plays a significant role in this composition. It divides this frame into 1/3 and 2/3. The lower part is more subdued, more homogeneous. At the same time, there are dynamic compositional elements on top. It works well together, even though the camera is quite low. If you had, for example, grass, gravel, stones, anything else here, such as non-transparent view, we would immediately feel that frog perspective. But through the sheet of water, we very often show the bottom as well, which visually builds a little more depth, because after all, the ground underwater is a little further away than the sheet of water itself. In the same way, we treat the reflection in the distance in the water as something further away than being just a few centimeters from the camera. And this fact is pretty important, which we will dissect in about a moment. If we jump to the 3D scene, we see that we have built it around the camera view. We even have several cameras located relatively on the same line. For these several cameras, several views, we rendered several images. For each camera, we have the lake in the foreground, the body of water we mentioned a moment ago. In the midground, we generally have the architecture and our vegetation. And the background is basically the terrain that we have set up here as display as box. Whereas if we display it, we can see that we have a dense grid of hills. It's basically the same as we have in the training scene, only in a form that is very much unoptimized. We have a couple of boxes so that excess atmospheric light doesn't come in from behind. The same we did before. We'll switch them on and off and see how impact generally they do in just a second. In addition, we have quite unusual clouds in this place. To be honest, it's an overkill in this scene, but we were experimenting with clouds, and this is supposed to resemble a cumulus cloud, to be a little bit more varied from an ordinary sphere. We have some noise applied there, basically, so nothing that much crazy apart from the appearance. What's more, we have an inner shape and an outer shape here. It's all based on volumetric material, so that the shadow that this cloud casts was supposed to be more nuanced, and it is indeed probably so. However, in this composition, we will see the shadow only on top of the mountains. It would be enough to put a sphere here, and the effect would probably almost be identical. We could now go into the render setup and see what lighting settings we have. As we can see here, we have illumination and override independently. And for the illumination, we have HDRI 1714 from the PG Skies. This is the same HDRI that we used in the first lesson on HDRIs. And as direct, as a reflection, here we have HDRI from No Emotion, 0607 day H. HDRIs from No Emotion can cause some problems if we illuminate with them, but they work fantastic as backdrop substitutions. And frankly, as of today, there is somehow not a lot of HDRIs where we would have a lot of these fine cumulus. And there's quite a selection of these types of scenarios in No Emotion. So when you're going for summer vibes, just swap it in No Emotion seems like a pretty good idea. In no emotion, we have gamma 0.75, so you can say a pretty typical move when adapting these HDRIs. A little shifted hue, a little raised saturation. Well, let's say such a classic changes for this type of HDRIs we do. As for our illumination, even that wasn't changed at all. This is HDRI simply working out of the box. And in this context, I want to emphasize that in general, in environment slots, in override, you don't have to use the same HDRI. You can use something completely different. If you just pair the directions and adjust the memory colors, then generally everything should be fine. And you can use a different HDRI for illumination and a different one for the direct swap, for example. And while we're at it, we can see what's going on here in terms of volumetrics. We have a couple of elements here. We have global volumetrics. Then we have box volumetrics, mainly covering these mountains in the background, slightly creeping in to the midground. If we take this material, we can see that this is the same material that we have globally. So this material is repeated. It's quite subtle globally, so this box kind of enhances this area volumetrically. In addition, we still have that cloud I mentioned. As for the cloud, we have 25k centimeters for distance, blue color, directionality at 0.2. As for this basic volumetric material, the settings are the same, except that the distance is very large, as we see. It's over 2 million centimeters. This is dependent on the fact that the scene is physically very large. So, in order to not to make it completely hazy, we have this distance value set at very high. We could check one more thing, and that is the water material. Because in this scenario, we are talking a little bit more about the water. So let's see what's going on here. So we see that the gloss is at 1, IOR at 1.33, which is a very standard setting for water. You could say default. We have the volumetric aspect, right? Set volumetric scattering at 50 centimeters. Directionality at 0.5. And we treat this water the same as we have with the fog. That is, under the surface of the water, we have a chance that a God ray may appear. This directionality is also analogous to the one we know from corona volumetric material. So we can use this option, especially if we shine from the back of the scene. We have a chance to make the variation of this volumetric behavior of the water more attractive. Under absorption and under scattering, we linked a color that defines this water. By controlling this color, we can make it seem more muddy, dirty, or clean. We can bring out many nuances with this color, so sometimes it's worth experimenting. And then there's this bump. It's a nice tree in the materials. Bump is set to 0.3 and there are different noises with different scales. These are usually typical max noises as a fractal, a little bit adjusted when it comes to the high and low ranges. We set different scales from 150, basically 1000 here. So we kind of try to play around these noises in different scales so that this sheet of water is strongly differentiated and not so uniform. And you can do this kind of material by trial and error. Usually at the very end, it looks very similar. And that would be about it for different elements of the scene. Let's start interactive and see how it looks. What we can see right away is some commonalities in terms of colors, in terms of light, in what we had in the scenario HDR lighting in our first lessons. And we use the same HDRI. We mentioned that HDRIs give a certain repeatability, and here we can see that in action. We have preserved memory colors, which practically out of the box are okay. Maybe the saturation seems a bit higher than normal, but with well-adjusted hues, it is acceptable. We can go into the tone mapping settings and see what's going on here. As we can see, even though the saturation seems high, we have it even reduced a bit. The saturation is very high in this scene, also probably due to this altered backdrop. Here we have tone mapping using Filmic, both highlights and shadows set at 1. We can see the ranges, even without applying the black and white LUT. We can see that these ranges look quite natural for the day. In general, we don't lose any detail in black and white parts of the image. Some parts of the trees may appear quite dark, but they take up a small part of the frame. Probably also they appear a little bit darker in the interactive than in the final render. And in my opinion, this is not a problem. So now, let's see how the depth was executed. We can hide those boxes that bring some shading to the foreground and see how it looks without them. We can see that the difference is not as big as it might seem, at least in the interactive. The trees have become a little brighter, as for the behavior of the water, it seems no change at all. It's not necessarily enough to insert something around the camera to affect the water. Water is a multidimensional material that we'll talk about more in just a second. Sometimes you have to go deeper into it to use water to control the composition and how the image looks. As far as these boxes go, there's no revolution here. Certainly, they don't let some light through, but it's not that much. In terms of volumetrics, starting from this box in the back, we can see that this difference is quite definite. These mountains went brighter in terms of ranges. Now they are similarly black as those trees in the foreground or midground. So this volumetric box does a lot. When it comes to global volumetrics, it's a barely noticeable nuance. At the interactive level, maybe not even noticeable at all. We could still remove those clouds to see how it looks like. As we can see that this cloud casts a shadow on those mountains. At this point, it can be hard to distinguish between the trees in the midground and the mountains in the background. Reason being, first, we don't have any volumetrics, and the ranges are very similar. Secondly, in both places, we have the subjects more or less in full sunlight. And those clouds were mainly introduced to cast some shadow on the mountains in the background, to make the building stand out as the center of the composition. It's important that the background generally doesn't steal attention. So we can go back with all these steps now. Remembering what we just had, we see that the shadow on the mountains is distributed a little bit more naturally. We can see that they are definitely darker than the midground with the sunlit elements. And as I said, the format of these clouds is rather an overkill, since we only see the shadow on a small part of this image. So that's all in terms of scene construction and its lighting nuances. Now I wanted to talk about something new. With this scene, I just wanted to mention a little bit more about water as one example of those seemingly uniform surfaces that we mentioned a little bit during our training. It covers almost a third of this frame. In the viewport, we see this area as a simple plane. When we build a scene based on the viewport, based on the 3D substance, based on the geometry of the scene, we often treat this type of surface as something uniform. We often intuitively see this as something homogeneous, in contrast to the elements where the geometry is very elaborate. When we look at this image, we see that there is a lot going on here, and there is practically nothing going on here. But this can be misleading, as we have already seen a little. It turns out that this material can completely destroy our composition, our intentions. Sometimes there is so much detail going on, it can completely draw attention to itself. And I would like to take this opportunity to discuss some options and how this material can potentially behave, and how the positioning of our camera may additionally relate to all this. How do we prepare for the different options of working with water? Mainly in the context of just these seemingly uniform surfaces. So now, I would prefer to discuss this on a finished renders instead of interactive in order to assess the details. So, we look at some finished renders now, rendered with different camera settings, with different water settings. We've been doing a lot of testing in the scene, and we'll use some of them now. Maybe let's start with how this type of surface behaves depending on our camera position in the scene. So, we have 3 images put together. The first one shows the situation we just talked about, where the camera is literally a few centimeters above the surface of the water, very low. In the second one, we go higher. The camera is positioned at about human eye level. In the third one, we are 10 meters above the surface. As the height changes, the material will react differently, and more specifically, some elements of the material will manifest themselves differently. For example, bump, reflection, refraction. Different aspects will take over. If we are closer to the surface of the water, we see more reflection. And if we are further away, we see more refraction. We can easily realize this when we think of tropical lagoons seen from a bird's eye view. We can expect this from the behavior of standard water and the placement of our camera. A higher camera approach will promote the refraction view more than reflection. That's what you expect from reality, and that's how shaders work. In addition, we have a greater view of what's going on below the surface of the water. Even small wrinkles on the water will appear much larger. Here, we are not able to see the individual wrinkles. They are too small, and if we look at it closely, it's not even blurred uniformly because of the noise in the bump. Some parts are sharper and some are blurrier. And even though you can expect a particular material behavior for different camera heights, it doesn't mean you cannot change it. You can as well see the bottom when you are high up, and you might not see any reflections when you are low. You can change and cheat with materials. You can adapt materials and kind of break the physical correctness. You don't want to stick to one relationship. We want to change and model it however we want. The fact that you can see more reflection than refraction is a compositional tool, and you can use it however you want. For many people, it's hard to make the leap and realize that light affects the composition. We were repeating that changing the light is redefining the composition. Here, we are talking about something even more nuanced, that the very setup of materials also affects composition. It's worth keeping this in mind because changing the bump and gloss does not seem like changing the composition, but it actually is, to a very high degree. We have the scene from the level of the human view, so that these certain dependencies can be better seen. In the middle, we have the initial situation. We have a gloss on one, exactly the kind of bump we saw just now, based on these noises. In this scene, we are trying to find a good compromise between having the nuance of the reflections of the water, but at the same time, still seeing the bottom. So we try to reconcile these two worlds. On the left side, the bump is at 0, the gloss is at 1, and everything resounds basically like a mirror. In general, looking at this image starts to give me a headache, and I have trouble understanding what's going on in this area. It's not very attractive. I think this even an objective opinion. Here we have a situation of a different type. This bump is as it was. But on the other hand, we have changed the glossiness to 0.8. In fact, the water doesn't have much possibility to change its glossiness to make it realistic. But we can assume that we are imitating a longer exposure time, that is, the water during a windy day. Its surface is quite wrinkled, and if we expose this for half or a second, the reflection won't be sharp. It will be a little blurred. In any case, it is acceptable to some extent as something realistic. And at this point, we are seeing extreme behavior, and it's hard to say that any situation is objectively better than the other. We mentioned that in this shot, this mirror doesn't look good, but there may be other scenes where it is okay. It's just worth realizing the options we have. Okay, in the final comparison, we have the aspect of refraction, or generally what we see under the surface of the water. With refraction, we can talk about what's under the water, which is the bottom, as well as the water itself. And there is volumetric scattering in the water we have in this scene. This gives the water some color that we have set in the material. If we take a better look, we can see the shadows that run under the surface of the water, the shadows from these trees. It's definitely not crystal clear water. There's just something going on in it. Well, and in this shot, we have distance absorption at 50 centimeters. And we compare that to distance of 5 centimeters, where the water is even more engaging with its color. Here, everything is broken, greenish. Practically, the bottom does not show through to us in any way. This loss of visibility underwater has the effect of calming this area compositionally. It just works more as a homogeneous area. If, on the other hand, we have water absorption at 500 centimeters, which is a value of 5 times the depth of this water, well, here we have crystalline water. The bottom is completely visible, and it also works quite different compositionally. We don't have color contrast. And again, I'm not saying that this is better than what we just had. Depending on what we need, we can have both reflection and refraction worlds present. And to summarize this first example, we want to say that the initial seemingly uniform surface can have a totally different appearance, and it will be very difficult to balance it by light alone, by adding boxes to limit the lighting. As we saw it exactly in our 3D scene, they had a marginal effect on how that water looked. In those situations, we'll have to go into the material settings to achieve a compositional effect. We'll constantly be balancing between several elements, how irregular the space is or what kind of bump it has, between how much this space works between the reflection and refraction axis, and the last component, how the camera works in all of this. Sometimes lowering the camera a little bit lower will build the depth better, which can be counterintuitive. This is the kind of nuance that can make the difference in whether a composition really becomes remarkable. It's worth realizing that sometimes changing the lighting in the same scene forces us to go into the materials, or at least some of them, and rethink them. Maybe with one lighting, everything goes right, and with another, it starts to go south. Okay, at this point, maybe let's move on to the next example. This is the last example in our whole training, so brace yourself, it's really something. In this example, we will talk about building depth, different techniques with volumetrics and VDP objects. Here, we have clouds floating among mountains. We also have clouds from corona clouds in the background. Everything is done in 3D, so there's a lot to talk about. We got ways to put it together in post-production, so we'll get right to the compositional analysis. There's a multitude of different layers here. We don't hide the fact that it takes some compositional experience to build such frames, but over time, such advanced composition don't cause trouble. It may seem hard to interpret such a frame geometrically, but as soon as you draw the lines, it makes more sense. The greatest importance is the dynamics of the foreground, outlining a certain spiral from the tree to the rocks at the very bottom of the frame, to the peaks in the background at the focal point. I also mark the elements that draw attention with stronger tonal contrast. All this dictates the dynamics of the composition. We have clear drop-offs between these layers, the edge of the foreground, which is something to watch out for. Let's see how it all looks in 3ds Max. And this is another environment built typically for a camera view. We have a camera positioned here. We also have the nearest foreground with a tree, with some rocks, plants. Then, the further we go, we can see all of it floating in the space. The midground, which is the mountain in the middle, made with the help of a satellite photo, with a couple of rocky outcrops on top, which also are spread out in space with all the scatters, the VDP objects. At the very end, we have two planes we used in the training with the mountains, with the same scatters as in the training. At the very bottom, we have a plane to cut off some possible light from underneath. In addition, we have a couple of objects such as tunnel vision box and volumetric objects of various types, which we'll talk about in a moment. There are a lot of techniques to create the impression of depth in this scene. We have tunnel vision, which covers the foreground. Then we have a box of the volumetric material to make the gradation of light between the shadow in the foreground and the light in the background. We'll see what it looks like before and after when we run the interactive. First, let's see the light settings and the settings of the other volumetric objects. Let's open the render setup and open the slate. Let's see what it comes with. You can see that we have atmospheric lighting from Corona Sky. Here we have our sun. We can see its settings, pretty standard. Except that the intensity is at 5. That's because this scenario is closer to sunset and we needed that intensity of light. As for the sky, the settings are pretty default. Volume effect at 0.4. We have corona clouds, which we'll say more about in a moment. In addition to that, we have two box-based volumetric objects in this scene, not counting this object that shades the foreground from outside the frame. We have a larger box that covers the background and midground, and this smaller box that covers the foreground. Let's start with the larger one. This is a simple volumetric material with a bluish tint and directionality at 0. We can see the volumetric material that shades the foreground. It is very similar. The only difference here is the distance. This one is much denser than this one, but this is also because of the scale of the boxes. In the middle, we have the third volumetric material, as in lesson number 3 on volumetrics. We use corona distance here, and we use the noise map. The task here is to add some nuance and fog around these mountains in our midground. We have corona distance at 15 meters from this terrain, which is more or less to go above the scattered trees. And we have noise on a large scale to introduce a little nuance somewhere. To see it in interactive, it would be necessary to hide a couple of scatters, especially in midground, where there are a lot of trees and bushes. There's quite a lot of that, so we'll hide it. And now, in this simplified form, it should be responsive. Of course, without the scatters, it will look a little bit different, but what's at stake should be immediately apparent. Let's turn our attention to the tone mapping. And here, nothing should surprise us. We have a default setting with aces and lowered exposure. And we can look at the rest. We can notice the horizon, which runs across a portion of the sky. The horizon is actually here. The geometry went a little below the horizon. A little bit of a mistake, but at the beginning, we lit the scene using the HDRI, and lowering it with the HDRI map manually is not a problem, but switching later to Corona Sun and Sky makes the whole process more difficult. For this reason, I didn't bother with the sky view at this stage and left this problem for the post-production, where we can solve some other things as well, but more on that later. The exposure doesn't quite fit. We could use override, but using corona clouds, it's hard to get this look in one go. So I basically generated a couple of additional sky renders that we'll see in post-production. We'll see how they are mixed so that the render is more or less what I expect. At this stage, we can see that these corona clouds here are quite faded. But if we lower it, we can see that the corona clouds are quite okay. And we let them cast shadows on our scene. That is, we can see that we have shadowing from the clouds turned on intentionally. In a large scene like this, that shadow from the clouds that falls on this huge landscape can be very attractive, but it can also be very hard to control, at least 100% of it. It may not be feasible, or you may not have the patience to iterate the effect. So here, as with clouds, we happen to render fragments for a couple of cloud settings, which you'll see later. We have a much brighter sun in the foreground. Here we have shadows. Something may fit more and something may fit less. So sometimes it's easier to just render a patch and glue it together later. Okay, at this stage we can see the sky, how it looks without the volume effect. We can see that it is not an essential option. It adds a little bit of color here, but because of the other volumetrics, we still have that feeling of the aerial perspective. On the other hand, it's nice to have it as a potential final tweak. At a low value, we can get a realistic feel with the additional color overlay. Now, let's focus on the other depth building elements. We'll start with the one closest to our camera, the tunnel vision box, which basically sets up this whole foreground. If we hide it, then we pretty much lose the feeling of darkening the foreground, which may be not so bad in the context of this tree. Whereas here, these elements seem too bright. You have to manually lower the albedo of the stones for sure, maybe some plants. It will definitely lose some expression. Here, also on the rocks, some parts became brighter. Not a tragedy, but I think the more intense foreground treatment works well for the scene. By the way, we can also see how the volumetric box on the side of the frame works. We can see that it softens the light in the foreground. Otherwise, it is quite intense. On the other hand, we don't want it to stand out so much, because we want our attention to reach the background, to follow this line. If we encounter the greatest contrast around here, it kind of ruins our compositional plan. So it is typical functional element to tone down some elements. We have two boxes, which we have already mentioned. The first one creates this fog over the midground. We can hide it to see what effect it has. We can see that without it, the whole thing gets dark. The fog is not too big here, but nevertheless, it adds a lot to the impression. We especially see it somewhere near the edges. It can also be said that it raises up the midground levels. The directionality is pretty important here, while we have the sun facing slightly backwards. In addition, with these parameters, we can see that it catches a lot of light. With directionality at 0, it would be much more uniform. Also, much more boring. We can also talk about the fact that the distance is quite small, 15 meters. I was tempted to increase it a bit, then this haze effect would definitely be more dominant. But it's easy to exaggerate and lose the readability of this landscape, so I decided that 15 meters would be okay. In addition, we have a third box with simple volumetric material, a little bluish scatter. This is an element that duplicates what's going on in the corona volume effect from corona sky. We can increase one by decreasing the other, and we should get a more or less similar effect. It can be considered that if we add this volumetric effect, it makes it all come together more interestingly. This background is very far away, but I think this color feeling, how it all comes together, is a little more interesting because of that. Okay, we can say something else about VDB objects. We have some clouds, and these are the same clouds from our volumetrics number 4 lesson. First of all, we can note that these clouds have a small scale. 0.01, for example, for this cloud. 0.04, More or less in such values it oscillates. Directionality I think at 0.3 to catch some light from behind. Everything here works on single bounce only, so it should render smoothly. With these small scale settings and single bounce only, these clouds don't look or feel too heavy. Rather, it's an extension of this fog that's being laid down here. Let's define vapor. If we raise the scale, we can see how it changes the perception of this cloud. It takes on a more definite form, and here we would definitely have to struggle more for that realism as well. We see that there are suddenly places where distinct shadow appears in the clouds. The issue of light to shadow transition with volumetric objects is easy to break this realism, and with single bounce only, it often just doesn't look right in strong light. Maybe we'll switch other clouds to make a larger scale to better compare it. We get a deeper shadows that don't quite look realistic. We don't get the detail because it's not an asset of clouds, which would be very, very detailed. At this distance, it might be okay. We also have a relatively large step size, which can affect the readability of clouds at larger scales. Right now, it's 500 centimeters. We can see that we can introduce more of this detail by reducing the step size. At 100 centimeters, it looks completely different. On the other hand, not necessarily better. We are just entering that uncanny region. There is a single bounce only, and this light doesn't distribute itself in the cloud and doesn't look completely convincing. We want to treat clouds as an extension of volumetrics, so this larger step size, this smaller scale at single bounce works okay. It also has the advantage of not rendering long, even if you have a dozen of these clouds. With this kind of setting, we are able to operate on this even in the interactive mode, have this feedback automatically. So I'm going to undo all the changes I made. In fact, I don't even need to, because it's a bit of a check on the scene settings. So we have seen all the elements that were viral in terms of building depth and all the volumetrics, how these individual elements function in the scene, and there's a little bit of it. Now let's take a peek into post-production and what we were able to pull from the renders and combine some of the approaches again. This is our raw render, what we just had, only with the scatters turned on. And as I said, we have a strange aspect of the sky with the horizon, with too much exposure. The clouds are barely visible, so that's what we wanted to improve here in the first place. Well, and above all, we rendered our sky in a couple of different passes. We moved the clouds, we raised the cameras a little bit, but the light that falls is more or less identical. The horizon went down a little bit because we raised the camera target up and made renders. A couple of different renders from which I'm able to pick bits and pieces and stick them together. This is more or less the feeling of the sky we are targeting, tailored in terms of brightness to what we have in the scene. We have layered our scene with different passes from the scene. Here we have a much brighter fragment. This is where the shadow comes in. I liked some of the elements here. we have a shadow in a valley that we don't want to draw attention to. What's going on in the foreground I liked better before, so I'm combining these two elements. We are taking this part from the old render, where these levels were cooler. Of course, different fringes appear in the sky that we inserted here, somewhere between those layers. It's not looking good, as we mentioned in the lesson on sunset. Something that will appear if we swap things with strongly different brightnesses. We can manually use a brush with darken or with another blending option somehow to correct it here, which we'll show you in just a second. So we don't worry about that because we have the tools for that. The next layer is to hand paint the clouds. This is an interesting option. I'll tell you right away how we did it. An interesting option because what we render in the scene, this cloud, we can treat not as the final impression of the image we will get, but rather as a base for further subpainting. We are able, for example, to create a new layer and take a brush to paint a fog. We used them earlier in the training, then there are a lot of them. Maybe with a little less opacity. Use what we have here and add some fog. I am sourcing the area and doing some brush moves. That way we are able to add some additional fog. I'm able to take the not so interesting edges of this fog and modify them, so that it has a little more character, such as jagged edge. And again, we are operating on a mouse here, but using a tablet for all of this will add to the control of the pressure of direction. Even on a mouse, it's a simple action. The clue is to have any brush to create the texture of the fog. Sample colors often and add more nuance to them. This is a very simple method that if we master it, and we should master it fairly quickly, we are able to quickly add many additional aspects to our work. And as in the last lesson, noise is missing, so we can add noise in the most trivial way and combine it all together. Now we can see that the fog we added, even if it was done quickly and without any particularly sophisticated tools, it's believable. This is how we drew the clouds in. First of all, in this area, to cut off the foreground to make this drop-off more readable in terms of depth. So, once again, before and after. We are adding some nuance to the floating fog, which without this is a little bit blocky and a little bulky. So it definitely adds some quality. In addition to this, we add haze using gradient to cut off two layers and create the impression of space. And that's about it for modifying this volumetric effect in post-production. The next steps are to add two branches here. You can see earlier that we had some more of these 3D branches at the very beginning. We erase some of them at this stage to make room for pasting in the 2D branches. In this shot, we are playing mainly with the silhouette, so there is no problem with fitting in this. The detail of real branch from the photo, real leaves, really do the job. This kind of thing introduces a feeling of realism that we care about. We introduced the branches, added a simple vignette, and did the fringe. At this stage, we did all of the bright edges by hand with a small brush, a simple soft brush on a darken. We might as well do it with a clone. The darken option firmly solves the fringe issues, exactly as we did in the Sunset 2 scenario. And then what's left are the final moves, which are the adjustments. So operation on curves, on colors. Here is still the final grading, that is, as we talked about in the last lesson. More operations on color, some operations on aberration, on some haze, so as to create an impression of this light. At the very end, two more patches. One patch where we render with different grass to add more nuance here. I didn't like the repetitiveness of the scatter, so I rendered the top without the scatter, with enhanced displacement. I'm pasting it here to break up the stock feel a bit, to introduce a bit more shadow. I think this is the final step. I did it quite late because it was already after grading, so this image is manually color meshed with such small patches. The issue of adjusting the color is not particularly problematic. And we went through all of it, so we didn't talk about some things too much, like this grading adjustment, but it's a little bit of a repetition of these messages from the previous lessons. We tried to focus on adding volumetrics in a manual way, and this feeling of the picture more or less ends this lesson. This concludes the series of how it's made and ends our training. So, what can we say? Again, we would love to thank you for this long journey with us. We hope you enjoyed the additional nuggets of knowledge and how to use it to your advantage. We cannot wait to see your work on social media. We wish you all the best in your career and see you sometime in the future. Cheers!